Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Daria and I am the Volunteer and Training Coordinator with Sacramento Steps Forward. We're thrilled to kick off the summer trainings with today's presentation on fair housing, policies that protect the housing safety and rights of individuals and families experiencing homelessness. As folks join, we encourage you to update your profiles like shown. And we'd also like to help you get to know who's in the room. So please post in chat if you're representing a community-based organization or if you're a landlord or tenant, etc. We'll give you all a moment to do so. All right, thank you for those who have already entered those in chat. Please do continue plugging them in as we go along. And then for the next hour, we will dive into part one of our fair housing policies. Then we'll jump into Q&A and a break before getting into part two to cover more issues that are recurring for people experiencing homelessness. We'll then open up the floor for group discussion. And then as a reminder, during the presentations, please drop your questions in chat and we'll make sure to circle back to those during our Q&A and discussion. During those times, during those portions, you will be welcome to ask questions in chat and also verbally. And we'll be watching the raise hand features in case you want to ask your questions in that manner. Now I would like to introduce Ryan Reyes, a senior staff attorney with Project Sentinel, who will guide us through these housing policies with the aim to protect and better serve this vulnerable population. Ryan Reyes has been with Project Sentinel for 5 years. During his time at the agency, Mr. Reyes has counseled both tenants and landlords on their rights and responsibilities, mediated countless tenant-landlord disputes, and represented the agency in fair housing complaints before the Department of Fair Employment and Housing in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Before joining the agency, Mr. Reyes graduated from McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento and has an undergraduate degree from the University of the Philippines. We have a lot to unpack today, so I will now hand it off for Ryan to start screen sharing and kick off our learning.
All right, let's head into the presentation, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. So for the presentation, we will be covering broadly federal and state fair housing laws, and the second part will be about disability discrimination and reasonable accommodations. We will see that the reasonable accommodations are an effective tool when addressing possible hindrances in finding housing for homeless persons. So we'll take a deeper dive into that section. Just a brief overview of what Project Sentinel does. We have 3 departments: counseling, tenant landlord counseling, and fair housing counseling. We do our work in different areas, mainly in San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, Sacramento County, and also a little bit in the Central Valley in Merced and Modesto. Having said that, our work in the capital in Sacramento County centers only on fair housing counseling. This program is funded by the county and the city of Sacramento, as well as the cities of Rancho Cordova, Citrus Heights, and Elk Grove. I talked earlier of performing fair housing services only. Other services that we refer people out to for eviction defense, it's Legal Services of Northern California. For information with landlords, we send to the California Apartment Association. For finding housing for homeless persons, we refer those matters to Sacramento Self-Help Housing, and we there are the fair housing providers. So a rundown of the services that we provide. We offer everything from answering hypothetical questions on fair housing, counseling people who have possible fair housing issues, to investigating them and advocating for persons who have fair housing issues by writing reasonable accommodations on their behalf, negotiating with their landlords, and possibly representing them at the DFEH HUD or even through private enforcement actions in court. This presentation is one of our longer presentations, but we do shorter ones, and if your agency would benefit from a presentation of anything from what we do as an agency, or a presentation like this, which is a longer presentation on fair housing rights, and we can do even longer ones, feel free to contact me about that and we can do a presentation for your agency. Likewise, resource fairs and brochures, we do want to participate in those, and if you have a resource fair or a spot that we could place, definitely inform us and I will get those brochures and participants in resource fairs together. So this is how to access our services. It's access through the Renters Helpline. We contract with Sacramento Self-Help Housing to provide fair housing services. So this is the entry point for the service. And what is notable about this is that it's not just our part in this is fair housing issues, which we will be learning about shortly. But any question related to being a tenant or being a landlord, this is the number to call. Things like, when should the landlord give my deposit back? What are my rights if the landlord is not repairing my unit? These are all questions that can be answered by the helpline. They may not necessarily be fair housing issues, but they are still renter issues that the helpline can help with. So going now to the order of presentation, this is what we'll be covering on this first part. So what is fair housing? What housing is covered by fair housing rules? Who are the responsible parties that should follow fair housing rules? What are fair housing protected categories? And what are prohibited activities? So with the first slide, like just to address the homeless population, similar to employment law, where discrimination applies once someone is hired, there's the same concept here in fair housing rules. We understand that the block to finding housing is really a financial part, and sometimes fair housing rules do not address that. If you look at this definition, the applicants have to have the same financial capacity before fair housing rules kick in. So we can't really say that discrimination is happening. If, let's say, there's a rule that all applicants have to pay 2 times the amount of rent, and we're not even going to include any vouchers in this, but if one applicant is not up to that financial standard, we really can't say that fair housing rules apply at that point. So having said that, we will go through situations where that can be addressed, but strictly speaking, fair housing is about having the ability of people with similar income levels to have these same housing choices, regardless of their personal characteristics such as race or national origin. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go forward. The next part of this is what types of housing are covered by fair housing rules. So who has to follow fair housing rules? What housing should they own? So this is a very broad definition. Any housing that is a dwelling unit, fair housing rules. And what does a dwelling unit mean? It's an occupied or designed as a residence. So that will include single family homes, multi-family apartments, mobile home parks, RV parks, condos, timeshares, co-ops. You can see the pattern here, occupied or designed as a residence, and even nursing homes, homeless shelters, group homes, residential care facilities, all are covered by fair housing rules. The exception to this is very narrow. There's a clear law exception to fair housing rules for single family homes where the owner occupier rents out one bedroom. So that just means that the landlord lives with the tenant and they are only renting out one room to one person. Under this law, if they were to rent out to two people, they would be covered by fair housing rules. But that gets muddled a bit by a relatively recent case that interpreted this, the fair housing rules not to apply to roommates sharing intimate living spaces. So if it's a house and people are sharing the kitchen and the bathroom, there's an argument to be made that be applied in that situation. So next up, we have who has to follow fair housing rules, and this is not practical. It's everyone in the housing ecosystem, whether it's renting, selling, mortgage providers. Everyone in the housing ecosystem has to follow these rules. So property owners, managers, maintenance staff, and though we focus on renters, this applies also to persons buying and selling homes. So lenders, insurers, real estate agents. Here's a favorite, homeowners associations. Fair housing rules apply to HOAs, property management companies, builders, and this will not get into because this is just technical ADA concerns. And we will not go into that in this presentation. So municipalities, and that just means local governments, and even neighbors, they do have to follow fair housing rules in certain situations. So we've gone through who has to follow fair housing rules and what housing is covered. Again, the exceptions are very narrow for those. So really the only exception is the larger exception and your person sharing intimate living spaces in the same home. So the fair housing formula, and this is what I use to determine if something is a possible fair housing violation, is this. Is a housing act done because someone is a member of a protected category? If I can show these, then there's a possible fair housing issue. I used to wrestle with this concept of protected category until I realized it was relatively simple to understand. So a protected category is a group of persons that fair housing laws designate as protected from housing discrimination. So it's just what the law says is a protected category. So there are multiple lists of protected categories. There's the federal list and there's the state list. So anything included in the federal list is also in the state list. So these are the protected categories under the Federal Fair Housing Act. These were the initial 5 protected categories: race, color, national origin, religion, and sex and gender. Later on, familial status was added, as well as disability. And let's key on familial status because it's not as well known as these other categories. And this illustrates how the law, that concept of what a protected category is just what the law designates a protected category is. So they designated in 1988 familial status as a protected category. And this status is having minor children in your home. So if you have any child under 18, you have familial status. It includes protection for pregnant women, foster families, and grandparents. And that's a recurring theme in analyzing and thinking about fair housing violations. The category may not be well known, but if it's designated as a protected category, then all of these protections that we're going to talk about will come into play. So as we talked about earlier, there's a federal list and there's a state list. Federal lists race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, disability as protected categories. California has more protected categories: marital status, sexual orientation, ancestry, source of income, gender identity and expression, military status, veteran status, immigration status, primary language, citizenship, and a catch-all category called arbitrary, which covers things like discrimination based on age, based on a person's occupation. So we'll go all of the, especially the ones that are not as clear, we'll go through them next. So what happens when something is designated as a protected category? What are those protections that come into play? So these are the protections, and you will see that they are through the lifetime of a rental or even a buying transaction. So once a group or once something becomes a protected category, there can be no advertising, no inquiring or asking about that protected category, no lying to a person because they're a member of that protected category, no different treatment, no harassment, and no eviction based on the protected category. So if you note, advertising, inquiring, and lying about this usually happens when you're trying to apply for a place. Treating people differently usually happens when they're already living at a place, and harassment is also happens when they're already living at a place. And then eviction is at the tail end of the process, of the rental process, if it gets to that point. So throughout all of that, fair housing rules apply. So we're going to go now, we're going to briefly run through all of these protected categories, and we'll focus a little bit on race and color just to solidify how to understand these protected categories and how fair housing rules protect people based on a membership of a protected category. So race and color are fairly easy to understand as a protected category. So what happens because race and color are a protected category, and let's just use that as an example, there can be no advertising that says no Asian tenants. There can be no inquiring based on a race, based on a person's race in a rental application. There can be no different treatment from one group, group, let's say Asian and Hispanic tenants. You cannot treat them differently while they're living at their units, giving one group repairs and the others no or slow repairs. So harassment cannot happen based on race, and obviously eviction. One group cannot be targeted for eviction while others are targeted for that. And it's fairly easy to understand. What becomes harder to understand is when the categories are not as easily understandable as race and color. National origin is still fairly easy to understand. This is where this category means that landlords cannot do those things based on where a person came from, their customs, and their cooking, which is part of a person's custom. This is a specific example in that, let's say a landlord says that they are charging a tenant who they think is Indian and their cooking, they think will stick onto the walls, a higher deposit amount. You begin to see that link between that housing decision, which is charging a higher deposit, and basing it from where the landlord thinks the person came from. So that there is a possible fair housing issue for that landlord. Disability is also a protected category. This includes mental and physical disabilities. Religion is also a protected category, practicing of religion, including religious dress. As long as they don't violate general law, then religion is also a protected category. So sex and gender is a broad category. It includes obviously protections for persons, whether they're male, female, LGBTQI, but it also includes other protections that other laws protect. So things like if the landlord, in exchange for sexual favors, says that the tenant doesn't have to pay rent, that is still a fair housing issue, aside from being a criminal or possible civil issue. If it occurs in the housing context, that's a possible fair housing issue. So hostile environment, this is more related. I talked earlier about neighbors could be responsible for fair housing issues. And this might be a case where if the landlord knows that that a tenant is being harassed by neighbors, calling them epithets like race-related or any kind of protected category related, and the landlord does not stop that behavior, that could potentially be a fair housing issue, since there is a hostile environment created for that tenant that may force them to move out at times. So we go now to familial status, which again we talked about earlier, is one of those less popular protected categories, but is a protected category nonetheless. So familial status is the status of having minor children living with a tenant or a home buyer. So we'll see as this presentation goes on, that fair housing rules there's a lot of interpretation and there's a lot of inference that can happen in fair housing rules. And it's a lot more practical than what people think it is. So occupancy limits. This here is a policy that affects families with children. So strict occupancy limit, like a limit that says you only can rent one bedroom, there can only be one person per one bedroom. That fair housing laws examine that as something that affects families with children. Because if you have a policy like that, a family with, let's say, 2 parents, 1 child, even 1 parent, 1 child will not be able to rent that apartment or that home with the 1 bedroom. So fair housing rules looks at policies, even though they may not look discriminatory on their face, and looks at how they affect people who are members of a protected category. And there will be themes of that as we go forward. You'll begin to see that. Sometimes fair housing laws look at the effect of a rule on a protected category, not just what the rule says. And you see it with these 2 things. So places that have strict supervision rules for children or do not allow children to play, those will only ever affect families with children. So since those policies are discriminatory against families with children, then there may be fair housing implications if, say, you have a policy that says all children under 18 have to be supervised by an adult while they are outside, or children cannot play with balls, bikes, scooters, things of those nature, things that make it likely that if a family with a minor child rents to a place, it dissuades them from doing it because of these strict policies against children. So we talked about this earlier, source of income being a protected category. This just means that a housing provider cannot choose where the income to pay for rent comes from they cannot choose that. So as long as the income is lawful and verifiable, the landlord has to consider that as income to qualify for a unit. So it doesn't matter if a person earns income from self-employment, employment, or from government benefits, and that now includes housing choice vouchers. And this is very important because you used to see, before this happened, like tons of Craigslist ads that said no Section 8. Because housing choice vouchers are now protected under fair housing rules, they now have all of these protections. So you really can't do that anymore. You can't say, no, we're not taking Section 8. You can't really ask a person, what are you using to pay rent? Are you using Section 8? That in and of itself is a violation. So once they start applying for a unit with a housing choice voucher and the landlord or the housing provider lies about not having a unit available or treats them differently in the application process, that is a potential fair housing issue. So when they get a unit, when they're not repairing units for Section 8 participants, on and on, that's a fair housing issue. And if housing choice voucher holders are being targeted for eviction as a group, that becomes a fair housing issue as well. So all of those protections now apply because a housing choice voucher is now protected under fair housing rules. So going on to our state categories, state protected categories, another one is citizenship and immigration status. So we, like with source of income, all of those protections apply to citizenship and immigration status. And this includes all statuses, including persons who are undocumented. So the landlord cannot ask about their immigration status, cannot require that everyone has a social security number. The only exception to this is when it's a federal program. So to get into the housing choice voucher program, legal status is required on the federal level. So that's an exception. But if it's a private property, not Section 8, not project-based Section 8, not voucher, they're not trying to get into the voucher program. They're just trying to rent a property that was built through private funding, then citizenship and immigration status applies, and all of that cannot be asked about or required as a condition of renting a place. So with the next slide, we have how we investigate fair housing issues. And this just helps in the referral process to know that we are dealing with a fair housing issue and this is something that we can handle. So obviously words that show discrimination are things that we look out for. Documents like rules, leases, notices, and this happens a lot with families with children and with persons with disabilities. So if there's a notice warning families with children only about noise, about children playing outside, that's a thing that definitely is a red flag for a fair housing issue. And termination notices related to behaviors of persons who may have mental disabilities. That is also a situation where it is a possible fair housing issue. The next way that we do that, while we do find statements as well as documents that shows discrimination, a lot of the time we have to develop our fair housing cases. And the ways that we do that is through interviewing tenants who are at the property and surveying tenants who are at that property. And for places that we suspect are not accepting certain members of a protected category, we do testing. So testing is like secret shopping. We send both of our testers will have the same financial qualifications The only difference will be that one is a member of a protected category and one is not. So let's say that we suspect a place is not renting to persons with a voucher. We send two testers, one that has a voucher, one that does not, and they do essentially the same thing in applying for a unit, and we find if there are differences in the way they're treated, and that helps us establish our fair housing cases. Having said that, and having gone through these protected categories, we begin to see that there's a very big need for a very diverse testing pool. There are multiple different types in each protected category. So we are always on the lookout for testers. And this is a volunteer opportunity that we have. We train testers year round. This is not a steady job by any means, but there is a stipend involved. There's training. So what it is people are trained to be testers. It can be done over the phone or in person. And there's a stipend involved for it. And if you know anyone who would like to explore this opportunity, definitely have them contact us or contact me directly, and we can set up training for testers. So we're going now to theories of liability, and this is mainly just to explain examples of possible fair housing issues and scenarios where they occur. So we've already talked a lot about this. It's a complicated legal, as with legal terms, they make it unnecessarily complicated at times. Disparate treatment just means they're treating people differently based on a membership in a protected category. What is to note here is there doesn't have to be personal prejudice or racial animus if in disparate treatment. So the thought here is if you're using a protected category to make a housing decision, you don't have to have personal prejudice. You can even have what in your mind is good intent. But if you're using if you're making a housing decision based on a person's membership in a protected category, that good intention does not matter. It's still a fair housing issue. So examples of this include policies charging wheelchair users high security deposit, no repairs for persons in a protected category. So the next example of this is steering. So this is where we'll more clearly show that thought of, but they have a good intention. Shouldn't that mean that they're not violating fair housing rules? So what is steering? This is restricting or attempting to restrict a person's housing choice by a person's words or conduct, and it's just connected to them finding a home, negotiating, buying, or renting a place. So there are multiple examples of this. The classic examples of this were, and this was prevalent long ago, like blockbusting, drawing lines where people can't live. So discouraging purchase or rental because of protected class, discouraging purchase or rental by exaggerating drawbacks or failing to highlight desirable features. And you see that this is practical. They're doing things differently for one group and not another. Communicating that the home seeker would not be comfortable with existing residents and assigning people to a particular neighborhood or building. So those are a little bit technical. Let's bring this down to an example level. So when a family with a toddler rents an apartment complex, that has multiple levels. So the housing provider, maybe the property management company, makes a statement where they say, and they make this out of thinking about the safety of the family. They suggest and recommend that the family with children lives on the ground floor instead of the apartment that they can rent on the third floor. That kind of statement shows a preference of steering people to a certain place in the building, and that would be a potential fair housing issue. because you see fair housing rules also protect housing choices for that family with children. Another more blatant example of that is, let's say that the housing provider, the property manager says, oh, there are a lot of Hispanic tenants in that side of the property, so that would probably be a place for that would make you happier to be at that part of the property. Again, that's a blatant example of steering. So other examples of fair housing issues include harassment and retaliation. So this fair housing rules prohibit harassment based on a person's membership in a protected category. Obviously, if the landlord, if the property manager, if maintenance staff are harassing tenants based on race, based on sexual harassment, that is automatically a fair housing issue. But the question sometimes is, what if the neighbors are the ones that are harassing other tenants based on a protected category? So like they're saying racial epithets, sexually harassing the neighbor. What could that be something that the landlord, the property manager, is liable for? And the answer to that is yes, if the property manager or the landlord knows that that is happening and they haven't done what they can to prevent that continued harassment from happening. So retaliation is another aspect of fair housing rights and is a fair housing violation in and of itself. So if a tenant decides to exercise their fair housing rights by calling the landlord out on their practices, contacting an agency like ours to call the landlord out on their practices, and the landlord decides to increase their rent or terminate their tenancy, that again is in and of itself a fair housing issue. So we have more examples here of how fair housing rules are fairly interpret a lot and see a lot as a fair housing issue. So just looking at advertising, anything that indicates a preference, limitation, or discrimination based on membership in a protected class is suspect under fair housing rules. So if you see ads, we talked earlier about no Section 8, see ads like no kids, or even something that might not be as, it doesn't ring a bell immediately. So things like for a rental, 1 bedroom this is a quiet community for single, quiet professionals. That can be interpreted as a preference for a preference against families with children. Symbols and illustrations, human models. This is an interesting case where that didn't reflect the diversity of the community. That becomes a fair housing issue. So selecting media or locations for advertising, things like if the landlord that most of the tenants speak Spanish and they continue to provide notices in English, that there is a possible fair housing issue in and of itself. So this would be a little better. I don't know if we can do this in chat, but feel free to do this in chat. A little better if one of those things that are a little bit better if it were in person. So this is a brief hypo of an ad. And the task here is to determine what can be left of this ad. So a senior citizen decides to downsize from her single family home and move into a smaller rental apartment. Family home on Craigslist includes these words: lovely 2-bedroom home, large garden, hardwood floors. Predominantly Latino neighborhood, single female preferred, no pets, no smokers, no children, must be employed outside the home. And this reflects Bay Area prices, but I don't know. We're soon getting there. So $3,200 a month, and this is our Bay Area office number. What could be left of this ad? And what could not be discriminatory that could be left of this ad? So really the only could be left in this ad are the description of the rental. So 2-bedroom home, large garden, hardwood floors, predominantly Latino neighborhood is out. Single female preferred is out. No smokers is out. That's not a protected category. No smokers is still in. That's not a protected category. No children. That's out. Familial status. Must be employed outside the home. That's out. Source of income. No pets is a wobbler. It can be left in. And we'll learn about this later, because a pet, using legal logic, an emotional support animal is not a pet. It may look like a pet, but it's not. So this no pets thing is still allowed in this ad. So those would be the only thing that could be left of this ad. So we talked earlier about how some actions affect particular groups. And when fair housing, and these are rules that are laid out by HUD and DFEH. So sometimes you have a neutral policy that doesn't necessarily you can't really immediately flag it as a fair housing issue. But when it's applied, it applies disproportionately to a certain protected category. And DFEH and HUD have said that this policy, should be applied with, should not be applied at all, should be applied with protections. So some examples of this. We talked earlier about occupancy standards. We have a guideline for occupancy standards called the 2+1 guideline. And this guideline just says that if you go below the 2+1 guideline, you're definitely committing familial status fair housing violation. But it is not a guarantee that if you go above this guideline, you're in the clear. And that's all this guideline is. It's a kind of, I don't know if it's a ceiling or a floor, it's a kind of, one of those. So it's the 2+1 guideline. If you go, that's sure shot a fair housing violation based on familial status. But if you go higher than it, it doesn't guarantee that you're not violating fair housing rules. So we talked about occupancy standards earlier. The 2+1 guideline says that per 1 bedroom, the occupancy, the maximum, like the minimum that the occupancy standard can be is 2 persons plus 1. So if you're renting a 1 bedroom, the minimum that your occupancy standard can be is 3 people. So if you have an occupancy standard that says there's 2 people for 1 bedroom, per 1 bedroom, that is automatically going to be a violation of fair housing rules related to familial status. But having said that, it's either presumed to be discriminatory if they're lower than that. Having said that, it is indeed that if you have a higher, if you have a 4-person per bedroom or even 5-person per bedroom guideline limit, that does not mean that that is clear of fair housing issues. So I did not list the case here, but there was a city in California that had an ordinance of 5 persons per 1 bedroom. And that even was struck down as discriminatory based on familial status. So there are certain other factors considered in making that analysis. One of those factors is square feet and this is very low for California. So occupancy restrictions considers this rule as part of the analysis on if your occupancy standard. So in California, the Health and Safety Code says for a place to be habitable, there has to be at least, for 1 or 2 people, 120 square feet of living space, all other habitable rooms at least 70 square feet. For more than 2 occupants, that 190 square foot room has to increase only by 50 square feet per each additional occupant. You can imagine that an 810 square foot 1-bedroom though in this rule can easily fit 5 to 6 people. So that's what I'm saying, that if you have a rule that goes above the 2+1 guideline, there is no guarantee that that rule doesn't a familial status violation, because this has to be considered as well. Another example of disparate impact is a rule made by HUD on the use of criminal records or arrests in the rental application process. So the genesis of this rule was the finding that Black and Latino men were overly represented in the prison system, and that rule would disproportionately affect Black and Latino men applying for housing. So HUD created a rule that says, and this is basically what it says. It says that a landlord cannot automatically deny someone of housing, cannot automatically say that their application is denied because they have a previous arrest or conviction. If, let's say there's a do you have a previous arrest or conviction, and someone checks that, and that's all the landlord uses to deny the person an application, this rule is probably going to apply. But this rule is more nuanced because it requires the landlord to look beyond just having an arrest or conviction. They can still deny based on an arrest or conviction, but they have to know how long ago it occurred, what was it for, did it relate to damage to or physical safety of others. They have to make that analysis. The rule primarily protects against just that blanket denial based on an arrest or conviction. So for other fair housing rules that we need to briefly discuss. So we mentioned earlier that immigrant status, citizenship status is a protected category under California law. California makes it illegal to inquire about a tenant's immigration or citizenship status, or require that the tenant certify their immigration or citizenship status. And that's primarily why we say that requiring that everyone has a social security number before they rent a place is a potential fair housing issue. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the pushback on the defense on a possible fair housing issue is a business-related reason. So some of the pushback on this is, how do we, as a landlord or as a housing provider or as a property management company, verify the identity of a person or their financial qualifications if we don't have their social security number, or if they don't have a government issued real ID? So this, the thought there is like, there are ways of verifying identity and financial qualifications. So for verifying identity, it can be a foreign passport, it can be a consular ID, it can even be an ID that doesn't, a state issued ID that is not the real ID. For financial qualifications, even for credit checks, an ITIN can be used for a credit check. Also, financial qualifications like making 2 times the amount of rent, things like business records, things like past tax records can be shown so that the tenant can show the landlord that they're financially able to pay for rent each month. So another added protection here is threats of reporting tenants to ICE or immigration authorities. And another are fair housing are violations under AB 291. The landlord saying, if you keep complaining, I will send you back to your country. That is a violation of that state law. So we talked about this earlier. Just a brief reminder that this is now a protected category. Use of a voucher holder is now protected under fair housing rules. And that happened, that started last year. So we talked about this earlier. All those protections related to protected category now apply to HUD voucher holders and other housing choice voucher holders. A lot, and it's a kind of popular technique, unfortunately, against voucher holders. And this just explains how to be done. So tenants with housing choice voucher holders, the minimum income requirements must be based on the portion of rent paid by the tenant. So let's say an apartment rents for $2,000, and the landlord requires that a tenant earn 3 times the amount of monthly rent. That would make it $6,000. If the tenant receives a voucher and their portion is only $200, and the housing authority pays the $1,800, the landlord can only require that the tenant earn 3 times the tenant's portion of rent, or $600. So you've seen some situations where the landlord says, oh, you have a voucher, but you still have to show me that you make $6,000 under the voucher, useless, if that were the case. But that situation does happen a lot. Well, we've heard it too often. And that is there's a specific rule for that. So the tenant portion is the portion that the tenant has to show that they earn, not the entire rental amount. Marital status, this is another one that we see a lot. Single roommates must be allowed to combine income if married couples are allowed to combine income to come up to the rental, the rental qualifications. This happens a lot with places that have that same qualification, like you have to make 2 times the amount of rent or 3 times the amount of rent. If you have that policy and you allow married couples to combine their income to come up to that policy, you also have to allow single persons to combine their income to come up to the 2 times or 3 times requirement. It can't be the case that the single person, if you allow it to married people, you turn around and say to the single persons, you both have to make 2 times the amount of rent or 3 times the amount of rent before I can rent this place. Single persons are combine their income. So with that, we are all right. So at this point, we've discussed the first half of we've gone through the first half. The second half will be heavy on disability discrimination and examples of how fair housing rules can potentially help homeless persons get through those barriers to finding housing, finding and keeping housing. So it is an ideal point for questions.
Ryan, thank you so much for leading us through part 1 of today's training. And for this next portion, we'll be taking questions from the group, either through chat or verbally. So please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask those questions. You can also raise your hand through that feature. Oh, I think I hear someone trying to ask a question. Please go ahead. There was a question earlier around the fair housing training that you mentioned, Brian. Is where are people able to access that, and when is that going to be available?
Is that for testers or for an actual training? So with both, I'm going to go ahead and place my email in the chat and just say for training for fair housing, definitely. For fair housing training and tester training, I would be the direct contact for that. I will pass that off to my colleagues. That can be channeled through me initially.
We do have Ryan's email here on the screen.
All right.
And we'll make sure to put that in chat as well. And then I see we have someone who's raised their hand. Robin, please go ahead.
Okay, I had a couple quick questions. One was how do you go about proving violations if you feel like you experienced one? Because it seems like some of these would be difficult to prove. So I'm just curious about the process of that for somebody who feels they've experienced a violation of some sort.
Okay. So we've talked about it can be difficult in situations. So we talked about words that show discrimination, documents that show discrimination. The other thing that I mentioned was, so if there is a place that discriminates against a person, say they have a voucher, they're not renting to them because they have a voucher. We send testers over, one that poses, well, they're posing as renters, one that has a voucher, one that doesn't. And that's how we can show possibly different treatment based on protected category. It can be a little difficult, but testers do make it easy. Surveys, interviews with other residents at the property, visiting the site itself can definitely help us ensure that a potential fair housing issue exists.
Okay, so somebody would just contact fair housing then to make a complaint about a particular location?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
Yes, you can contact us and we can develop the case further.
And then my last question is probably a little shorter. Is if someone does not speak English, do they have to be provided notices in their language? As you mentioned, the idea of most of the tenants were Spanish speaking, for example, and all the notices were provided in English. I don't know if
they do. If the housing provider, and they should know the composition of their tenants.
Sure, yes.
They have to provide with a notice in their, usually, I mean, if we write them a letter about that, they usually comply with that.
Okay.
But that's a potential fair housing issue if they don't.
Sure, okay, thanks.
Okay, so it looks like we have a couple more questions here. So there's a question about, would that apply to the deposit as well? I would need a little more context on that question, but for the Q&A portion, we can take that on.
Carlo, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask around that question.
Oh yeah, I was asking. I know the speaker was, or Ryan was talking about requiring ×3. They have to make ×3 of the rent as far as their income. There's cases where where you have to match the deposit, the security deposit has to be equal to the rent, and sometimes people with vouchers they'll only pay 30% of their income. So when they require the security deposit, can the person with the voucher be required to pay the full contract amount?
So we talked earlier about the voucher holder being only responsible to show income related to their portion of the rent. So whatever they pay is what, if it's a 2 times 3 times requirement. The deposit, though, is a different issue. That's different. Sometimes the tenant has to come up with that. That rule doesn't really necessarily apply to the deposit. Because those are different things. The 2 times and 3 times requirement and a deposit amount. That's why we have agencies that assist tenants with footing the deposit amount, because the voucher doesn't necessarily apply, unless there's some change in policy, then it doesn't necessarily apply to the deposit. Now your 2 times 3 times requirement, they can only ask for the tenant's portion of that, but not necessarily the deposit. Does that explain that? There's 2 things: the 2 times 3 times requirement and the deposit amount. With the 2 times to 3 times requirement, a landlord cannot require the tenant to make 2 times and 3 times the rent. If they're a voucher holder, they only have to make 2 times and 3 times their portion. But that doesn't necessarily apply to the deposit. The deposit may well have to be paid in full by the tenant.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. So for the 2 times, and I see another question here about 2 to 3 times the rent. If a couple, do both need to have that or combined? So technically, I can see a situation where the landlord can require both spouses to have 2 times the amount of rent. If they do that, then they don't run afoul of fair housing rules, because marital status is a fair housing protected category. If they apply that to everyone, then that just means you have a 4 times rent policy. Well, yeah, if they apply that to everyone across the board, then that's fine. What becomes a fair housing issue is if only married persons are allowed to combine their income to come up to that 2 times to 3 times rent requirement.
Please feel free to turn off your video and put yourself on mute, and we'll see you when you return.
Hey, Catherine.
Hi, yes.
I remember Ryan talking about assistance animals or companion animals aren't pets. Would and if they had a dog, but they also had this companion as a companion animal, would the landlord or property manager be able to apply you have to have your dog on a leash, because that's how normally we would tell residents at our other properties, but and it's now that he's saying it's not a pet, would these rules apply?
Ryan, are you still there? Would you
I'm
be able
still
to respond
online.
to that?
Oh, Ryan.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have asked you directly.
That's fine. I mean, you thought that I wasn't there, so. All right, the thought to that is general rules still apply. like things about behavior, things about getting shots, they apply. The thing that doesn't apply is you can't deny the tenant an emotional support animal if they need it based on a disability-related reason. So, and we'll talk about that later during this presentation, because that is a topic. So the leash rule is a general rule. Everyone should follow that. There's no disability-related reason of allowing your dog to be off the leash unless the tenant can show that. But in general, what would the disability-related reason be for leaving the dog off the leash?
Yeah, I would. I don't know. Sometimes they say it's. They don't really give a reason, but there's like, you know, we kind of come up with our rules, and they say it's not a pet. It's not considered a pet. So
yeah,
so they feel like they don't need to put it
behavior rules
on.
are fine. Yeah, behavior rules on pets, emotional support animals are fine. The issue is more denying people from having emotional support animals. Obviously, if you have a rule that, you know, your animal cannot bite another neighbor or like be a nuisance to another neighbor, you're going to apply that regardless of it being an emotional support animal. The main concern is you could say, well, this particular emotional support animal has violated general rules on behavior for all pets that apply to everyone. If that happens, then you can ask the tenant to get rid of the particular emotional support animal and get a new one. The problem really comes in when you just deny them from having an emotional support animal.
Got it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you.
Also, Ryan, we had a participant who joined at the later portion of part 1. Just a clarification question on if the 2 to 3 times rent applies to HUD CoC assisted participants as well. And Ryan, if you're speaking, you are on mute.
So I would look into that further, just because I don't have the rules for continuous care properties right now, and I messaged the participant about that. Hello?
Thanks, Ryan.
Okay. It's like, all right, now I really am going to take a brief break now.
Okay, thank you for letting us.
So for the second part of this presentation, we're concentrating on disability discrimination, as I feel like this is the category that would most be applicable for homeless persons experiencing, that would help them get through these barriers of finding housing. So for disability discrimination, Fair Housing Act, FEHA applies, Section 504, and that's for federally funded housing. And we do have the ADA Titles 2 and 3 as well that apply. So at the start of this analysis, and this is mainly going to be about reasonable accommodations and modifications, the person requesting an accommodation or a modification must fit the definition of disability under federal law or state law. Both of these definitions are roughly similar. So both have, for a person to be considered as a person with a disability, under both federal and state law, they would have to have a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activity. Under federal law, the definition is a little stricter in that it says that it substantially limits. But like we talked about, for fair housing rules, state law is always the one that we go to because it has more protections than federal. So persons who are currently disabled, persons who have a record of impairment, and people who are regarded as impaired all fall under this definition of disability. So this is not an exhaustive list of physical or mental impairments, but these are what are typically considered as physical and mental impairments under the federal and state definition of disability. So any kind of physiological disorder, contagious disease, genetic disfigurement, anatomical loss, mental retardation, emotional or mental illness, specific learning disabilities, alcoholism, and substance abuse. So substance abuse is starred there because this has to be, for it to be considered a disability, there has to be some showing that the person is in recovery and not currently a substance abuser. If the person is in recovery, then recovering from substance abuse is considered potentially a disability under federal or state law. We talked about major life activities. These are just everything that a person does on a day-to-day basis. Very easy to comply with: walking, seeing, self-care, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, working, taking care of yourself, manual tasks. If a person has a physical or mental impairment that interferes with any of these life activities, and it doesn't have to be substantial because we are following state rules, if there is that impairment that limits any of these activities and more, any kind of daily, day-to-day related task, then it potentially can be shown that the person has a disability under state rules and is entitled to a reasonable accommodation. So reasonable accommodations, and we will be going into a lot of examples of this during this session, are changes in a housing provider's rules, policies, practices, or services. And these changes are necessary so that a person with a disability can have the equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. So people talk about things being game changers. A reasonable accommodation is an actual game changer in that it can change a lease, it can possibly prevent eviction, it can create additional services for a person with a disability. So a modification, on the other hand, is a change, a physical modification to an existing structure, again necessary for a person with a disability to use and enjoy a dwelling. So some examples of reasonable accommodations include permission to have a companion animal in a building with a no pets policy, extensions of time to move out, creating a closer parking space, assisting applicants with developmental disabilities in completing a rental application, permitting a tenant to have a caregiver transfer from a 1-bedroom unit to a 2-bedroom, and accepting applications from persons with disability who lack rental history with a note from the social worker. So reasonable modification examples include the following. We talked about this as being a situation where there will be a physical change to the structure. So things like installing ramps, grab bars, removing carpet from a unit, providing a visual alarm for a person with a hearing impairment, widening doorways, even things like disconnecting a stove or installing a microwave for a person who's unable to safely operate those things. There are kinds of changes in structure that a reasonable modification can be at. the tenant can request a reasonable accommodation for those things. So we talked about this earlier, reasonable accommodations. As we said earlier, it's 3 things go into this. That the person is disabled under federal or state law, showing that they have a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity, and that the person needs a change in the rules so that they can enjoy and use the property. Things to note when asking for a reasonable accommodation. So the first thing is, these requests are not automatic. There is no burden on a landlord to be proactive on reasonable accommodation or modification requests. It's good, but there is no duty for them to act unless the tenant requests for an accommodation or modification. So that request is not automatic. Having said that, it is fairly easy to make an accommodation or modification request because it does not have to be in writing, although we do recommend it to be in writing. And the time to request for a reasonable accommodation stretches all the way from applying to a unit to the day of your eviction hearing. So throughout that time, the tenant can ask for a reasonable accommodation. So with all reasonable accommodation requests, there have to be brief descriptions of 2 things. And it's important to have these 2 things because this is what triggers the landlord's housing provider's responsibility to respond to a reasonable accommodation request. Brief description of the disability, brief description of what the tenant is asking for and why it's necessary because of their disability. So as we go further into this process, there may be situations where the landlord, the housing provider, can ask for verification of both the disability and the need for the accommodation because of the disability. And there may be situations that they cannot ask for that. If the disability is clear and the reason for the accommodation is clear meaning it's clearly visible, and we're going to use a apropos example here. Let's say that the tenant is visually impaired and they use a seeing eye dog. That there is clearly visible to the landlord. And all the tenant has to do in that situation is tell the landlord, I need you to change your no pets policy because I need my service animal, who is the seeing eye dog. The landlord cannot at that point ask for any other proof that the tenant is disabled or that the tenant requires a service animal. It's both the disability and the need for the service animal is clear. If either are not clear, then the landlord may ask for verification. So let's say that the tenant is dealing with anxiety and depression and that they have been prescribed an emotional support animal. Landlord obviously the anxiety and depression is not visible, and the need for the emotional support animal is not visible. During these times, the landlord can then ask for verification regarding the person's disability and that the request to the accommodation is necessary because of the disability. So in that example, a note from that tenant's doctor or therapist that they are dealing with anxiety and depression, and that the emotional support animal would assist in coping with that, and therefore the no pets rule should be relaxed. The landlord can require a note from a doctor, from a therapist, from a nurse practitioner, or a social worker that shows the disability, that describes it briefly, disability and the disability-related need for the accommodation. So even when the tenant asks for a reasonable accommodation, there can be reasons that the landlord can deny that accommodation or modification. One reason is if that's why it's called a reasonable accommodation, a reasonable modification. Actually useful adjective there, reasonable. So, but then that requires analyzing a lot of other elements. So one of them is if it's an undue financial burden. So let's say that a landlord has one property that has 2 floors, and that is their only rental. There's 4 units at the property, and one tenant on the 2nd floor asks for an accommodation to have an elevator installed. So that may be denied by that landlord owning only one property, since that may be an undue financial burden. And that may be a reason to deny that request. So just a brief note here, accommodations, and the elevator example is a modification. So accommodations usually just require changing rules, and that usually isn't going to require any kind of financial burden. So allowing a person to have an emotional support animal, there's hardly any, if at all, financial burden to changing that rule. So for the modifications, one thing to stress there is that tenants, the general rule is tenants are on the hook for paying for the modification. So the landlord does not have to install a shower bar or a grab bar or a ramp on behalf of the tenant. The landlord can also require that the tenant place an amount in escrow so that when the tenant leaves, the place is returned to the condition that it was before the modification was installed. So the exception to that rule is for federally funded housing. And there's a whole list of federally assisted housing. And if a property is on that list or receives that type of funding, and that's where the Section 504 comes in, that's when a landlord, the Section 504 landlord, has to pay for the modification. But the general rule is, in privately funded housing, which is most housing, the tenant does have to pay for installing that modification. Another reason for possibly denying a reasonable accommodation request is that it constitutes an undue administrative burden. So let's say that a tenant again, going with and it primarily protects mom and pop landlords with these analysis. Undue administrative burden, a tenant requiring that their trash be picked up from the unit on the 2nd floor in a 4-unit apartment, in a 4-unit fourplex, that is the only rental. So again, the landlord is not required there in that situation to have someone on site, and that might be an administrative burden for that landlord to do, despite the tenant's mobility issues and being on the 2nd floor. So other reasons for denying a reasonable accommodation or modification is if it alters the nature of the housing provider's services. So this is a little complicated to say, but easier to describe. So if the accommodation is, the tenant is asking for, is that the landlord, picks up their groceries or takes them to a certain place. like to their medical appointments. That is a situation where the landlord can say that the tenant is attempting to alter their business, which is just to provide housing and not to provide transportation. The last one is actually the most cited one, because this involves saying that the accommodation granted or the modification granted constitutes a direct threat to the health, safety, or quiet enjoyment of other residents, staff, or visitors. So the direct threat has to be documented and verifiable and not just speculative. So we're going to talk a little bit more about emotional support animals, but a way not to comply with this is to simply say that if a person has an emotional support animal that is a dog, and it is of a certain breed, and we all know pit bulls are probably the most cited, if it's solely because of the breed and the landlord feels that because of the breed, the animal will be a direct threat and cannot be an emotional support animal, and there have been no verified incidents of the emotional support animal biting a neighbor or causing damage, and that's not a direct threat. They cannot say that it's merely because of the breed of the animal that the emotional support that they cannot be an emotional support animal. So just a brief recap of what we talked about. When in doubt, just dance. This is a mnemonic that we use to analyze if something is a reasonable accommodation request or a reasonable modification request. So disability, does the tenant have a disability defined under fair housing laws? Accommodation, is the tenant requesting a change in the landlord's rule or practice? Is that accommodation or modification necessary for the full use and enjoyment of the property? So the first three, the answers have to be yes to that. And the next two, if the answers are no, then you know that it's a reasonable accommodation or modification. So for cost, does the accommodation or modification impose an undue financial and administrative cost? And the last one would be the effect. Would it have a fundamental change? So if the first three are yes, last two are no, then the housing provider should grant the request. So this takes us into an example of just how flexible reasonable accommodations can be. And this is based on a case. So James here is a longtime tenant at Sugar Mills apartment. He had accosted an elderly neighbor, and the neighbor reported that James used obscene, offensive, and threatening language, causing that neighbor great anxiety and making that neighbor feel fearful of their physical safety. So because of James' actions, the elderly neighbor moved out. James was even convicted in criminal court of disorderly conduct, and the property manager moved to terminate James' tenancy. James responded that his outbursts, which he characterized as neither threatening nor harassing, were the result of his mental disability, and requested that Sugar Mills make a reasonable accommodation to allow him to remain as a tenant. So Sugar Mills refused to grant that accommodation, saying that the conviction in criminal court specifically shows that he is a direct threat to the health, safety, and quiet enjoyment of others, and they do not need to make any efforts to accommodate him. Surprisingly, or for some surprisingly, they still need to accommodate James despite that conviction, because James here was able to show a link between the events of that conviction and his disability. And this is called a second, I don't know how many times this happened with this neighbor, but this is called a second chance reasonable accommodation. I suspect that James showed that it was disability related and that there was also a plan here shown by James to the landlord of how these incidents can be minimized in the future. So even with that conviction, the reasonable accommodation still has to be granted for James here to have a second chance to live there, because the incidents were primarily due to a possible mental disability. So in these situations, we talk to the landlord about what happens when we do investigate these cases and negotiate on behalf of a tenant. And what is important here when advocating for these tenants in these kinds of situations is to make sure that there is some mention of a plan that will show that the incidents that the landlord complained about will not occur in the future. It is the second chance, and it's not like the 20th chance. So that kind of mitigation effort has to be shown before a reasonable accommodation for a second chance can be granted. So this here, with that direct threat strategy case study that we talked about. So while the landlord is not required to rent to anyone who is a direct threat, they cannot deny housing based on fear, speculation, or stereotypes about a particular disability or disabilities in general. So that direct threat must be based on reliable and objective evidence. And even with that, there's still a potential to get a reasonable accommodation if it can be shown that the tenant is able to minimize the behavior that led to that possible eviction. So the following will be examples of how flexible a reasonable accommodation request can be when applying for housing. So maybe dealing with these barriers to housing. And this was shown by our last example, our last case study. So if a criminal record being an obstacle to housing. So if an individual has a criminal record and the conduct was because of their mental health disability or even addiction, where they're recovering from, like we talked about earlier, that can be a disability if the person is recovering. And they can demonstrate that they've received treatment or medication, and they can show mitigation efforts. Then what we can advocate for is that that criminal record that was a result of previous addiction or a mental disability, we can advocate for the landlord to change their policy and not consider that criminal record if it can be shown that the actions related to that to the criminal record were related to a mental disability, happened because of a mental disability, or the person was recovering. The person is now recovering for substance abuse, and that happened while that happened a while ago. So steps that we would take in these kinds of cases is definitely to contact the landlord to ask about what the problems are, and steps that can be taken to support the tenant in this situation is to ask for references from previous landlords, definitely show rehabilitation efforts and circumstances have changed so that the behavior that was done in the past will not happen again. So that's how powerful a reasonable accommodation request is. It can change a policy of requiring someone has no criminal record. It can possibly do that. Another thing that it can do is, again, change a policy of considering credit scores. So if a person has become disabled and they are no longer able to work, and that results in a negative credit record, if their bills haven't been paid, again, it just shows a very flexible tool if something can be connected to a disability-related reason. So the person is on SSDI, they're no longer dependent on employment income, and the loss of income and the subsequent like negative credit hit was because of a disability related reason. If that connection can be shown, then we can advocate for that person and ask the landlord that the negative credit history not be considered in their application. There could even be, so reasonable accommodations, there's a lot of ways that they can help. One way is to have something not considered, and the other way that rules can change is to add a rule like this. If the tenant cannot qualify and may require a co-signer because of their disability, then that is also something that can be advocated for as a reasonable accommodation. It would be good to see. There are also other situations, again, no previous rental history. So if a person lacks rental history due to a disability and previous long-term hospitalization, and the person's health has stabilized and can begin to move into an independent living situation, then again, that person can ask for the landlord to relax their rental history policy. If it can be explained that the lack of rental history is related to a disability reason, then that policy can be relaxed in favor of that tenant. So the way we would strategize that is maybe to consider references from a social worker or an employer, apart from landlord references, get support letters, as well as contacting the landlord directly so that that policy is changed in favor of this tenant. And on down with the negative landlord references. So this usually occurs when a tenant has moved out or has not reached to us before they've moved out, because we could do a second chance on this kind of situation. But if they've moved out because the landlord sent them a notice that they were being disruptive, they had behavior issues with another neighbor or management staff, and the landlord refuses to give them a good reference or gives them an outright negative reference. Again, as we've gone through the other examples, if that can be tied, that event that led to the negative reference can be tied to a disability related reason, then again, we can advocate for that policy to be changed and that negative landlord reference not be considered in a tenant's application. All of this is really collecting paperwork and support that the tenant will be a good tenant, and that event happened because of a disability related reason. So contacting the landlord, getting your support letters from counselors, employers, and therapists, all of that also comes into play. We talked about this briefly earlier. Reasonable accommodations are so flexible that we can require changes in rules to help someone apply for a unit. So in this case, and this is based on an actual case where the tenant had a voucher, a HOPWA voucher. This is housing for persons with AIDS, and they could not qualify for a unit. And the only way that they could qualify was to have a co-signer. And even that change in policy of requiring co-signers because a person has a disability, even that is a reasonable accommodation that a potential tenant can ask for, and a landlord must approve if the connection between the disability and the need for accommodation can be shown. That case by far is like a case that, and you can argue that, housing really is, it is necessary for health. That shows it. The person needs housing because it's like a basic necessity for someone's continued health. and changing that policy to allow them to have a cosigner so they can have housing is a potential reasonable accommodation. Other things that can be changed. This has become popular now because of the situation, the health situation that we are all going through. This here, an example here is a nursing home resident transitioning to a private housing and might require an ambulance transport and is not able to apply to a unit in person. So right now, because of like one of the silver linings of this pandemic situation is that people have begun to transition into like electronic signing of forms, no need for personal in-person applications. But that would have been one of the situations where you could also ask for a reasonable accommodation. Assistance with applications themselves are also subject to a reasonable accommodation. So things like filling out application forms, making forms easier to read, all of that is subject to, it can be the subject of a reasonable accommodation request. So with that, you've seen how reasonable accommodations can be fairly flexible in overcoming obstacles to housing. But like we talked about with all of these fair housing protections, they apply not only when someone is trying to get housing, but they also apply when someone is already in housing. They apply to change rules, they apply to change policies like we talked about. So one policy that can be changed due to a disability-related reason is the rental due date. So a lot of leases say that you need to pay rent on the first of the month. And there's a legitimate business reason for that as well. I mean, the landlord wants to be sure that they have enough funding to continue their business, so they require everyone to pay rent on the first of the month. That lease term can be changed through a reasonable accommodation. So if someone is receiving SSDI on the third Wednesday of every month, receiving SSDI in and of itself shows a disability and the need for a different rental due date. So even if the landlord, the housing provider argues that shouldn't that be on the tenant to budget better, that isn't necessarily the case, because the tenant can ask for a reasonable accommodation to pay for rent when their SSDI comes in, so that they're not charged late fees, so that they're not charged. So in some cases, but not all, we've been able to successfully require a landlord to rebate the late fees and penalties because of this, because the landlord was insist on that first day of the month payment, despite the tenant receiving SSDI and paying rent and needing to pay rent later. Here again is another situation where the flexibility of a reasonable accommodation can be shown. Cognitive disability issues or poor memory, it makes it difficult for them to remember when rent is due. A reasonable accommodation, again, if you don't run into these fundamental, an undue burden or an undue administrative burden issue, the tenant can make a reasonable accommodation request that the landlord, the housing provider, provide them a call or provide them with a notice to remind them that a rental payment is due because of a disability-related reason. So you begin to see how flexible this reasonable accommodation is. As long as something can be connected with a disability-related reason, a rule, a policy of a complex can be changed to accommodate that person with a disability, and sometimes even services can be added or a rule can be made, not just relaxed, in favor of a tenant with a disability. So with that, we will go into one of the more popular reasonable accommodation requests, which is a request for an assistance animal. And off the bat, there's a bit of a confusion on this because of the ADA and service animals. So under ADA, the ADA talks about service animals. And there can be only two kinds of animals under the ADA that are service animals. It's either a dog, and since their lobby is very, very strong, or a miniature pony. Those are the only two animals that can be a service animal under the ADA. ADA, that dog or miniature pony has to have specific training to do a specific task. So let's say detecting seizures. There has to be specific training there. And the ADA extends more to other things, not just housing. There's the restaurants, movie theaters, flights, shops. The definition for an emotional support animal or an assistance animal under fair housing rules is not as strict. So first of all, if it's a dog or a domestic animal, there's no restriction to type or breed. We talked about this earlier. If the emotional support animal is a pit bull or Rottweiler, there's no restriction to that. As long as there has been no history of that emotional support animal being a direct threat, then the landlord cannot restrict, or housing provider cannot restrict based solely on the type or breed. A rule last year clarified like what types of animals under the federal rules anyway can be emotional support animals. So there's now a kind of dividing line between domestic and wild animals. So things like tigers and snakes, you may have to show very specific proof. The landlord may require very specific proof and do the job that the tenant wants it to do, which is an emotional support animal. It becomes more difficult, as opposed to if it's a domestic animal, dog, cat, fish, then the standard is a little lower. So like we talked about earlier, for fair housing rules, the emotional support animal does not have to have, or the assistance animal does not have to have any specific training. It does not need to do a specific task. So it only has to provide support to a disabled person by virtual presence. Once a pet is at things where, it's not a pet anymore, you cannot charge a pet rent or a pet deposit. Does not need to be. Okay. So with emotional support animals, however, they still need to follow general rules. So things like being on a leash, having them vaccinated, the landlord can require that. The thing that cannot be done is denying the person with a disability of having an emotional animal. There's general rules that can apply to all animals in general, both pets and emotional support animals. The main preventing someone from having an emotional support animal should not be done. So proceeding on with how reasonable accommodations can help keep housing. or prevent eviction. So things like poor housekeeping or hoarding. Hoarding is usually related to a possible mental disability. And again, if a person is disabled and this is happening because of their disability, there are a number of things that we can ask for. So if this person was issued a 3-day notice to clear clutter, and the clutter hoarding issue is related to a disability, then we can ask for more time to have this person clear the clutter. If they're already being evicted based on the hoarding issues, again, more time to clear and even possibly prevent the eviction. With these issues, as with the issues related to a mental disability and possible harassment of other tenants and other management staff, the tenant with the hoarding issue has to show a type of plan that will address the issue. So if that is shown and the disability related reason for the hoarding is shown, then the reasonable accommodation to give more time to comply with the notice, or to give more time and suspend the eviction, is an easier ask and should be dealt with by the landlord. So that same goes with the preventing. This gets repetitive, but it bears really repeating because it is such a flexible tool. So the same goes with damage to a property. If the damage was because of a disability related reason, and this might happen if the tenant has a child that has a disability and damaged the property, and if it can be shown that that was the reason, again, we can ask for an extension of repairing the damage, or even postpone the eviction as the issues are dealt with. So each of these are case to case. Each of these do require talking to the landlord and advocating on behalf of the tenant and showing them that efforts are being made to address the issue and that things are improving. So the same with tenant conduct. We have talked about this as well. Management has a policy of evicting tenants who engage in violent or disruptive behavior. Showing that that behavior is related to a mental disability will again be a situation where a reasonable accommodation can be asked for. And again, it bears repeating that that situation, the strategy always involves, with all of these situations related to conduct, related to hoarding issues, possible threats made to other neighbors or management staff, all of these do require a kind of showing that the tenant is dealing with this through new treatment or further support so that these incidents do not happen again. So even things like the landlord doesn't want to renew their lease because of behavior issues, wants to evict them because of that. Like we talked about earlier, a reasonable accommodation can reach these things so that the eviction notice can go away, so that the landlord can reconsider renewing a lease, just as long as the disability reason is connected to the behavior and there is a plan going forward to make sure that the behavior does not occur. Noise violations are also the thing. Particularly, and this is an example that we do have a lot of. Sometimes sometimes in cases that involve familial status, they also have disability elements. Like this case where a child with autism occasionally screams or makes loud noises, and neighbors complain about that. You get your noise violation issues and you eventually get a 3-day notice. Again, attempts have to be made. There's a couple of ways to deal with the situation. I've seen maybe moving to another unit as an accommodation if the tenant is willing to do that. soundproofing is a little expensive for these kinds of situations, but that's a modification that the tenant can request for. Obviously, soundproofing is something that the tenant has to pay for. It can be requested. And these are just things that show that general pattern. Give us a second chance, because this is a disability-related reason that led to these noise violations. And these are our suggestions about how to move forward and and minimize the situations that led to the notice or led to the possible eviction going forward. So with all of those examples that we talked about, this next case study shows perfectly how all of those concepts can be tied together. So Evelyn's landlord serves her a 30-day notice to cure or quit based on her failure to maintain her home in a clean and sanitary condition. So these are the issues in her unit. There's a foul odor that emanates from the rest of the building. The toilet is frequently filled with feces and urine. Garbage, rotting food, dirty laundry are everywhere. So Evelyn doesn't clean, or she doesn't vacate the premises. She was given a 3-day notice, and she didn't vacate during that time. And the landlord filed an eviction case, and this case is now in the eviction process. So before the hearing of this case, Evelyn requested a reasonable accommodation for a mood disorder that affected her ability to keep her apartment safe and sanitary. So she supported this reasonable accommodation request with a note from a caseworker from APS who said that they could offer assistance to Evelyn clean her unit, and they also mentioned that she was an outpatient at a substance abuse clinic. So what the landlord did with this is that they did not respond to the request. They figured that because of all of this, this qualified as a direct threat to the health and safety of others, and that this would not constitute a fair housing violation for failing to reasonably accommodate a tenant. Well, the short answer to that theory is that that was a wrong theory. So here we have why that was wrong. So this is a encapsulation of everything that we've talked about. So Evelyn here is disabled. There was mention of a mood disorder that affected her ability to clean the unit. So the nexus between her disability and request is clear. Health will continue to get better if she continues to maintain housing. So did Evelyn make a reasonable request for accommodation after the filing of an unlawful detainer eviction action? She did. But the important part about that is even if you're in the process of eviction, again, before judgment is had, a reasonable accommodation request can be made. So even if it was at that point, the landlord still had to answer that request. So did Evelyn specify a specific accommodation request? In this case, she did not. So this just shows that it doesn't have to be anything super technical. It just has her request was just, I need more time to handle this because my hoarding and failure to clean was related to a disability reason. And it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be more than that for the landlord to have this duty to answer Evelyn's reasonable accommodation request. So as we talked about earlier, in this case, those reasons were not considered enough to be a direct threat. My theory here is that if you can provide a plan going forward that minimizes these incidents, then it shows that this is not a direct threat, or it can affect that analysis of something being a direct threat. So would the RA request be unduly burdensome? Not really, because all the landlord would have to do is stop the eviction proceeding, give Evelyn more time to do the work, and there is an APS worker helping her to do it. So those would not really be unduly burdensome. So when could this be unduly burdensome? If the facts were changed and it were shown that they did give Evelyn a chance to get this corrected, and even with that, it continued to happen, then maybe it becomes a burdensome request. But like we talked about, the key word is a second chance. It has the, if it happens repeatedly, then that becomes burdensome. So these are just tips for housing providers. The worst response to make to a reasonable accommodation request is not to respond. Because once a reasonable accommodation request is made, there grows a duty on the part of the landlord to go into this thing called an interactive process, which is just a fancy word for negotiating with the tenant or hearing the tenant out, well, first hearing the tenant out about the request, or if you can't grant that request, talking about what other options is available for the tenant to accommodate their disability. So in that last example, the error of the landlord, the main error of the landlord was not to respond, to just not respond and not to engage in that interactive process. That interactive process is required. So it is required once a tenant makes a reasonable accommodation request to engage with the tenant. If the landlord does not do that, that's a potential defense in an eviction case where the tenant can say the landlord did not engage in reasonable accommodation interactive process, therefore this eviction, they can defeat a possible eviction. The connection between, so like we talked about here earlier, this just recaps everything. If a disability and a need for a disability-related need is clear, like with a seeing eye dog, the landlord cannot ask for any further verification. But if it's not clear, like for a mental disability and the need for an emotional support animal, the landlord can ask for a verification that the person has a disability and that they need an emotional support animal. So we talked about a burden on the landlord, whether that's a financial or administrative burden. Those are the things to consider in granting a request. And again, it cannot be stressed enough. The worst response to a reasonable accommodation request is not to respond. Because once a reasonable accommodation request is made, it triggers the duty on the part of the housing provider to engage in the interactive process, which means that they have to go back and forth with the tenant to talk about a possible reasonable accommodation. So another thing with reasonable accommodations is at times a landlord can propose a reasonable accommodation. Where I can say, hey, what about this? This would accommodate you, this would accommodate the tenant. The tenant does not have to accept that. In these situations, reasonable accommodation requests, the tenant is always the expert about what they need related to their disability. And while the landlord is free to suggest accommodations, ultimately it is on the tenant to approve that accommodation. So like this last sentence says, like, it's not obligated, tenant is not obligated to accept alternative accommodations suggested by the provider if the tenant believes that they will not meet their needs and their preferred accommodation is reasonable. So just for, this is just for reference. So 504 contains more rights for persons who are in covered housing, like certain programs that have certain federal subsidies. There are more rights. The thing that we talked about earlier, the 504 properties, if a tenant is there and they require a reasonable modification like a grab bar or a ramp, then it is possible that the landlord or the housing provider if they fall under Section 504, they need to pay for those modifications. And there are other rules that Section 504 housing providers have to follow that do not apply to housing providers that don't receive certain federal funding. It's something that we do on all of our cases. We try and find out if a property is under Section 504 because there are more rights in certain that apply. So with all of these issues, if there is a situation that we find that there is a fair housing violation, we have evidence of that, then we do go to either the DFEH or HUD for enforcement, or regular court if necessary. But we like to go through the DFEH or HUD first, since that's a relatively quicker process. So just something to note about administrative complaints and lawsuits and the statutes of limitation. So for federal court, it's 2 years from the alleged discriminatory act. And for administrative complaints, it's 1 year from the alleged discriminatory act. So relatively quicker in admin court than in federal court. So the person who experienced the discrimination, we as a fair housing group, government agencies, can all file a complaint. Damages tend to be higher in federal court because you have all of these other damage calculations available. In HUD, DFEH, we typically see awards from $15,000 to $65,000, and that's the range that we typically see for these administrative complaints. But at the same time, they are not, things that are for an administrative complaint are not as complex as things that we take to regular court. So with that, this is a resource page here that we have. And if I will make this PowerPoint available at the end of this presentation. And with that, I think we can segue into further a Q&A session.
All right, thank you so much for that very thorough presentation, Ryan. Now that we've reviewed different aspects of fair housing laws in several of those case studies, we open up the floor for you to ask questions or share your thoughts and commentary. Please feel free to unmute and ask your questions verbally or continue posting your questions in chat. Again, I'll be watching those hands that are raised.
Okay.
I think someone was going to ask a question.
Yeah, I want to ask a question. Hey, Ryan, so I have someone that had requested a reasonable accommodation to transfer. She's in a 1-bedroom unit. She wants to transfer it to a 2-bedroom unit. Disability was verified. There was a nexus, and however, the problem is when transferring to that 2-bedroom, it's funded. You have to have a certain voucher, and in order to qualify for that voucher, she needs to be homeless. Can a reasonable accommodation be submitted to the housing authority to change that rule?
See, the connection would have to be shown on that rule. Like, how would that be done? I mean, the rule is a preference for homeless persons, right?
I mean, of course, well, my property has been like, you need to be homeless to qualify to live here. So, you know, at one point she was homeless, chronically homeless, but obviously for transfers, you know, it says you can transfer, but the rule also says when you qualify a person to move into this unit, you have to be homeless.
So if the move, we're just going to concentrate on disability. So do they need to move to this unit because of a disability-related reason?
Yes.
Then maybe that rule can be relaxed. Because if they need it for a disability-related, is it a mobility-related issue? Do they need to move to the ground floor?
No, there's 3 people living there. It's like her and the mother and 2 kids, and we asked for she gave the disability and we asked the doctor for the nexus, and you know, it was.
I mean, it just depends on how clear it is, because usually we get requests like this for mobility-related issues to move to a ground floor unit. If it is clear, then I say it's worth a shot to ask for that rule to be relaxed.
But I guess would the reasonable accommodation request, I mean, let's say we're approving the transfer, but you know, the housing authority is saying we're not going to give you a voucher because you're not homeless. Can they submit a reasonable accommodation? Because you said,
yeah, I would say I would try that if it's if it's a clear nexus to it, yeah. And they're applying to the housing authority too, so they should have like a grasp of this, like a reasonable accommodation request.
Right. Okay.
I can chime in here. This is Michelle Watts, the Chief Planning Officer at SSF. And sounds like what you're talking about is sort of a transfer of unit off of a housing authority type voucher. What I can say that we do in the coordinated entry system, which is the HUD CoC, permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing locally, is when a household needs a transfer within that system, then we do have policies and procedures that point to relying upon the person's homeless status at time of move-in to their original placement. And then there's a way from there, because it's a transfer, not a new placement, to then carry that person over into a new unit or an entirely different program if that's what they need. It's not even connected to fair housing. It can be. Sometimes it's connected to safety or, you know, issues with the particular service provider. But there may be, and I will say HUD CoC side of the house and Public Housing Authority side of the house are way different. There's not a lot of connection there, but maybe there's some work that SSF could do in partnership with SHRA to figure out maybe some policies where certain transfers can be accommodated and not be so difficult when there's a reason that a change needs to be made, and that person would still be homeless if not for the voucher.
Got it. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay. All right. So I have questions here from the chat. So one is regarding the James example. The understanding is of a tenant in a situation that might cause the landlord to evict, and the situation might have been caused in disability. The tenant can request for a reasonable. Okay. So this shows to have the medications adjusted for 60 or 90 days. So not so much on the day requirement, but this does show that the tenant is showing some type of mitigation effort, and that goes into whether this request is reasonable. Is that with these requests for second chances, you always, the reasonable analysis part of it, it always takes into consideration if the tenant is showing mitigation efforts. So I would say put in as many kind of mitigation efforts that you can in this kind of request. Well, that's what we do when we advocate for these. And that shows that it's a reasonable request. And with these types of situations, it goes back and forth with the landlord because the direct threat and safety issues are legitimate concerns. So we do go back and forth with the landlord, and we do assure the landlord that these mitigation efforts are being done. But as far as the specific day requirement, that's not necessary. So then the other question is about the property insurance dictating breeds. I know that there's current litigation on this, and we talked about it earlier, about everyone in the housing ecosystem being subject to fair housing rules. And that goes for insurance companies as well. So with their policy, it can be argued, violates fair housing rules because they're refusing to allow property insurance based on a breed of dog that a tenant brings onto their property. That is a to be continued kind of question because that's currently being litigated. Section 8 applies to share a unit, which can help them. I would have to look further into the section, the SHRA policy on this, because it might be different in according to like where like based on the admin plan. So the question is if 2 Section 8 clients can share a unit which can help them from being homeless and meet the rental rate.
William, do you mean can 2 Section 8 vouchers be combined by 2 people that have been approved to have them in order to pay more rent than fair market?
So this, I would say correct. Yes, there's the. I was going to invite the poster.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I'll leave it to you, Ryan. Sorry.
All right. So I think that is the case. So then this is April, right? I think. Hello?
William.
Yeah, William. And who was answering earlier?
Oh, sorry. This is Michelle from SSF again.
Yeah, go ahead and.
So what I was going to say is that there isn't really an SHRA and no housing authority can pay above the FMR based on bedroom size. So that's going to be your determining factor. So we couldn't pay because there's 2 vouchers at play, pay more than FMR. But when it gets down into the details, could 2 individuals rent a 2-bedroom at FMR because they have 2 vouchers? That's going to be a question for SHRA in terms of whether they can do that. But they definitely can't pay above the FMR for any bedroom size. So
Understood.
A 2-bedroom has a cap, as do all bedroom sizes.
Understood. Thank you.
So the next question coming in is, if it's a service animal, no pet deposit can be asked for. However, if it is an emotional support animal, can the landlord ask for a deposit? No, the answer is the landlord still cannot ask for a pet deposit on an emotional support animal. We talked about this earlier, and just to clarify this again, service animals are a concept under the ADA. And it's very strict about that. They have to have training. For fair housing rules, the concept is assistance animals, and this includes service animals and emotional support animals. Under fair housing rules, any kind of assistance animal, whether it's a service animal under the ADA or just an emotional support or an emotional support animal, the landlord cannot ask for pet rent or deposit.
again, if you guys have any more particular cases that you would like to talk through, we have Ryan here who's available. Please don't be shy to ask those questions. And Ryan's just dropped that renters helpline again in chat.
And definitely, if you don't feel the pressure to have a question. If you do have a question, you can email me or call the renters helpline. All right. So Evan has raised his hand. What is the Go ahead. And
my question is, if your landlord is going to accommodate your needs and is going to make whatever fix it is, but they're dragging their feet and they're taking a long time, but you don't necessarily want to, I know you said there were steps that you could do before going to Sacramento Housing Authority. Can we talk a little bit more in depth about those, please?
Okay, so is this about repairs?
Repairs and accommodations.
Okay, so give me more detail on this. It's definitely.
So I work with a housing program where it's because of like the FMR and a lot of our clients like criminal backgrounds and things like that. We're really limited in the amount of, or in the places that will take our clients. And a lot of the times we're kind of like stuck with these landlords who really like drag their feet on repairs or don't get back to us or aren't really like helping in a client situation where, like earlier you talked about accommodations where if a client is feeling unsafe or like getting discriminated against by a neighbor rather than the landlord, but how it is the landlord's duty to intervene in that situation. A lot of the times the landlords are very just kind of unresponsive. And then when they do start to like fix it, so let's say like, so right now I have a client whose AC is broken in her apartment and we're having these crazy heat waves like every other weekend, it feels like. And I have reached out to the landlord. She has reached out to the landlord. It took a while for the landlord to respond, like a week before the landlord responded. Once they did respond, they said that, okay, their person was going to go out there and look at it. Now they've looked at it and they're like, okay, we're going to replace it, but they don't have any kind of like, it's still not replaced. It's been several weeks. Like she needs AC.
Okay. So there's two ways to handle this depending on the situation.
Okay.
This sounds like it's a tenant-landlord concern. If that's the case, then obviously the landlord has to be given time to fix this. The usual time, though, well, it's AC and it's very hot, so they should be fixing this immediately. Takes you into kind of options that are not as good. Maybe not warning the landlord about withholding rent, but that's very risky. Maybe going to small claims court. The other thing is if it's related to a disability reason that they need to have their AC fixed, and I think this can be fairly easily established, is to do a reasonable accommodation request that can be referred to us. Which just leads me to the kind of faster response that happens when landlords get a letter with a letterhead on it. And language from an agency like ours. So that might be a thing to refer to us, just so the landlord has a response faster.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, perfect. I thank you for that.
I'm not seeing any new questions in chat. I'm also checking for raised hands
earlier.
Yeah, so if we're missing anyone whose hands are raised, please feel free to unmute and ask away. I do have a question for you, Ryan. Under poor housekeeping and hoarding, what is the period of time in which residents must make a plan and implement that plan to address the issue? Is this unique to each case, or is there that
It is
strict timeline?
That's why that's the reasonable part of a reasonable accommodation request, because initially it's the tenant that has the burden of showing a plan, and obviously if it's to be reasonable, there has to be some reasonable deadline to get it done. If that doesn't happen, then it becomes increasingly possible that a landlord can issue a termination notice or a correction notice that if the tenant doesn't comply with, then they can go to eviction court for that. But it is a back and forth. Initially, the tenant gives a plan, meaning part of being reasonable is having a reasonable deadline for getting things done. If the landlord feels that is not being done, then steps can be taken, just issuing another new notice, and then eventually going to eviction court. Having said all of that, it is still up to the court to decide if the reasonable accommodation request was denied prematurely. But yeah, part of that reasonable analysis is the timing of it and setting up benchmarks of what things have been done and should be done at what time.
Thanks for clarifying that. And also, does the tenant and landlord, do they need to develop this plan together, or what's required there?
They do. That's part of the interactive process, which tenant and landlord goes back and forth to see what accommodations can be made. But yes, you do have to make that plan together, and that is the way to handle these things. Like we talked about earlier, the worst response to these things is not to respond. So if you respond and say, the landlord says this might not be reasonable, but here's my suggestions, and go back and forth like that, it becomes a situation where the landlord is less likely to violate fair housing rules.
Well, thank you for that, Ryan. We did receive a question earlier from a community member that we would like to ask this diverse group present today. So the question is, once off the streets, do agencies help with other issues, mental health, addictions, and possible job training? This is open to everyone. Feel free to answer with an adult, youth, and our family lens here. I don't see this community member online right now, but this is something that we can share back with her afterwards. We can also circle back to this question if there's someone else on the line who wants to ask Ryan a direct fair housing related question. We do have a few more minutes remaining, so please feel free to chime in with any other thoughts or commentary on any of those case studies that we reviewed earlier.
So I did have a, well, it's a one.
Go ahead, Ryan. Were you gonna ask something?
No, I had a scenario about, what do landlords have to do with like hoarding issues, and do they have to provide certain things for a tenant to help get rid of their clutter? So with what the landlord can provide, it depends. Like we talked about with reasonable accommodations, there's an analysis there of undue financial burden. Now, if it's a large apartment complex that has employees that do collect trash and like have the dumpsters that they can move around, then that wouldn't be so burdensome. But it's a case-to-case thing. I mean, it depends on how much resources a landlord has, on how that affects how reasonable a request is.
That was my question, Michelle from SSF, which I just asked directly to Ryan because I did miss the first big chunk of the training. I didn't want to re-ask something you already covered. So I was just asking, can a tenant ever call on the landlord to help pay some of the costs associated with mitigating hoarding, like renting a dumpster and having stuff hauled away? And then, as Ryan's indicated here, it really depends on the landlord's ability to provide that kind of support financially.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is a big issue with a lot of maybe not a lot. It is a recurring issue with folks in our permanent supportive housing programs. And so, Nika, thank you for raising that issue, and then Ryan for responding to it. It's a really, as folks know who have tried to deal with it, it's a really tough issue. It's very emotional for our clients. It's very difficult for a client and landlord to work through. And I think it's incredibly relevant to problem solving what you all encounter in your work with your clients. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. And it's not also the resident themselves, but also whoever else they're living in the home with. And so they're
Right.
Everyone, this is something that we don't often talk about, but it does happen out there in our community. So definitely wanted to bring that to light there. So we do have a few more minutes remaining. If just wanted to check back if there are any final questions or comments from the group. Before we dive into our final remarks, we do have a quick poll question for you for those who are still on the line. Let me bring that up. And we have that here. Did your knowledge of fair housing rights and responsibilities improve with this training? Please feel free to drop in those responses. We'll give you a few seconds to drop those in. All right, if there are no more responses, closing this poll. And it looks like overall we have a yes, and we have lots of learnings from today. That is great to know, and I'm sure Ryan is also thankful for that feedback. All right, so jumping into our closing updates here from SSF. Moving the slide, there we go. Thank you again for all of you for sharing those questions and examples earlier. Before we head off for the day, I would like to share some of these quick updates with you. We're organizing our next training in a few weeks on domestic violence and human trafficking. And we'll be sending a save the date with the registration link soon. We highly encourage you to visit our website for information on our upcoming trainings, including that one. And if you haven't yet, please also sign up for our newsletters to receive those latest news and updates from us. We'd also love it if you can spend a moment to complete our post-discussion survey at the link I'm dropping in chat right here. And again, I'd like to thank you, Ryan, for your wonderful presentation and your willingness to answer our participants' questions here. And to you all for spending your Friday morning with us. This was a big chunk of time, and we appreciate you, your participation and engagement here. Again, this recording is going to be made available along with relevant materials on our website soon. And with that, I wish you...
Can I jump in real quick?
Yes.
I wanted to say this at the beginning, so I apologize. I was overbooked earlier. This is Michelle from SSF. Today's CoC provider training is Nika's first one that she's organized for us. She's done an excellent job. The August 20 domestic violence and human trafficking session, I think, will be great as well. And I just wanted to point out that, well, thank you, Nika, for doing such a nice job. But this is an additional staff position we've added at SSF to be able to bring you more trainings more often on the things that you care about. So thanks to everyone for participating today. Thanks to Ryan and Nika. And I think you can expect to see more trainings from us more often of this quality. So thanks everybody.
Thank you. Appreciate you sharing that, Michelle. And that's why our post-discussion survey is going to be important, and so that we can continue delivering you all these trainings that are pertaining to the issues that you're facing and the questions that are coming up in your day-to-day work. And so you guys should have already access to that links that I've just gone over here. Again, with that, I thank you all and wish you a wonderful and relaxing weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.